Hi, this is Remembering the Past with Corey Franklin, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. And we're all sports again this week. We're going to start out with John Thomas, who died recently at the age of 71. And John Thomas was the greatest American high jumper of the late 50s and most of the 60s. As a college freshman, he jumped 7 feet, and he was a great star in the Milrose Games in the late 50s and early 60s. Milrose Games were the most important amateur track and field events held in New York City. When he was a freshman at Boston University, he high jumped 7 feet at the Milrose Games in 1959, and it stands as one of the great track and field performances ever at Madison Square Garden.
Track and field sensation of the year was the 7 feet, inch and a quarter high jump of John Curtis Thomas at Madison Square Garden. A dazzling new world record for the 17-year-old Boston U freshman.
The leader of the game said that was the largest ovation he ever heard. Unfortunately, John Thomas's name is not well known today because of 2 other men. Even though he was America's best high jumper, he did not win the gold medal in either 1960 or 1964, and we'll talk about that in a second. By 1968, John Thomas had been surpassed, and he was surpassed by a new technique and a new man. The technique was the Fosbury flop, and the man was Dick Fosbury. The Fosbury flop was a new way of high jumping. It was revolutionary in track and field. Before Fosbury, Thomas and all the others had jumped the straddle technique, where they faced the bar as they went over it. Fosbury revolutionized this with the flop, where he approached the bar from the back. It allowed him to get greater speed and higher elevation, and within a few years, virtually every high jumper in the world was using the backward technique of the Fosbury flop. But even in John Thomas's heyday of 1960 through 1964, he was surpassed by another high jumper, a Russian high jumper, Valery Brumel, also one of the last to use the straddle technique. Brumel is a legend in Russia, and many believe him to be the greatest high jumper ever. He ran a 10-5 approach up to the bar, and in those days they jumped from a hard rather than a spongy surface. And many people believe he could have cleared 8 feet with his speed and approach, and he always seemed to best John Thomas just by a little bit. The rivalry of John Thomas and Valery Brumel is considered one of the greatest ever in track and field.
The most exciting track and field event was the high jump duel between John Thomas of the U.S. and Valery Brumel of Russia. Brumel, who beat Thomas in the Olympics, tied his own best mark in this indoor meet, and then went on to a jump of more than 7 feet 4 inches. The Russian defeated Thomas in every one of 3 meets with form like this.
No matter how good Thomas was, Brumel seemed to beat him just by a little bit. He beat him in the 1960 Olympics, where one of Brumel's compatriots won the gold. Brumel won the silver and Thomas won the bronze. For the next 4 years, they were the 2 best high jumpers in the world, and they competed against each other in a lot of indoor and outdoor meets. In 1963 in Moscow, before 75,000 people and Premier Nikita Khrushchev, Brumel defeated Thomas. And in 1964 at Tokyo, Brumel won the gold and Thomas won the silver. The competition between the two was a surrogate for the Cold War competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. There were other competitions in track and field and other Olympic events, and it carried through to the 70s when the Soviets became the first team to defeat the American basketball team in the Olympics, and even into the 80s when the Americans beat the heavily favored Soviet national hockey team. The long ongoing Soviet-American rivalry was best exemplified by Brumel and Thomas. And unfortunately, John Thomas is left today with the legacy of never winning the gold medal despite being America's greatest high jumper in the early 60s and being eclipsed by both Valery Brumel, the Soviet, and his fellow American Dick Fosbury, who introduced a new technique into the sport that John Thomas dominated before him, high jumping. We're going to move on now to our feature tonight, Stan the Man Musial, one of the greatest baseball players ever. Stan died recently at the age of 92, and to put him in perspective, he is often considered the greatest left-handed hitter ever in the National League. You have to consider Barry Bonds and the steroid issue. But without question, Stan Musial is the greatest St. Louis Cardinal ever. And the St. Louis Cardinals have a long, proud tradition, perhaps second only to the New York Yankees, and you're talking about some great players. So when you say Stan Musial was the greatest St. Louis Cardinal ever, you're really saying something. He was a first-ballot Hall of Famer, and here's a little info on Stan Musial.
When Musial retired in 1963, he held or tied 29 National League and 17 Major League records. He was the National League's answer to Ted Williams. Even by today's standards, his numbers are still astounding. Musial is still in the top 10 in hits, RBIs, doubles, games played, and total bases. He hit 475 home runs despite never leading the league in that category. had 1,815 hits at home and 1,815 hits on the road, and was the first player to appear in more than 1,000 games at two different positions.
I set my sights on some things, and I tried to achieve those goals. I didn't try to compete against anybody else.
Stan Musial was a nice Polish boy born in Donora, Pennsylvania. Donora, Pennsylvania is also the home of Ken Griffey and Ken Griffey Jr., so there's about 1,300 home runs by my count between those three players, and since Donora only has about 75 or 8,000 people in it, I think you have the highest home run to inhabitant total for Donora, Pennsylvania. He started out as a pitcher, and he hurt his arm, and he became a left fielder. He later went on to play first base too. He helped the Cardinals to 3 World Series in the 1940s, 1941, 1942, and 1946. 1946 World Series was the Bobby Doerr World Series. We talked about him recently. Here are some notables, including Bob Costas and Tim McCarver on Stan Musial.
Cardinals icon Stan Musial has died at the age of 92. The Hall of Fame outfielder spent his entire 22-year career with the St. Louis Cardinals.
Stan Musial began his major league career with the St. Louis Cardinals in September of 1941. 2 years later, he was the National League's most potent offensive force. He spent 1945 in the Navy as World War II was ending, and upon his return to baseball a year later, Musial was once again the king of swing.
The greatest tribute you can pay to an opposing player is that when he steps into the batting cage, everybody stops what they're doing and watches him hit. And we all did that.
He got more ovations, standing ovations, than the whole Brooklyn Dodger team combined.
Well, he got his nickname, Stan the Man, from the Brooklyn fans.
One day in June of 1946, the fans started chanting. And they started chanting, "Here comes the man." And Bob Bragg, legendary reporter for the St. Louis newspaper, turned to one of his colleagues and said, "What are they saying? Here comes that man?" And the other fellow says, "No, here comes the man." And the next day, Bragg wrote in the paper, "Stan the Man Musial."
In a career full with Hall of Fame achievements, Stan the Man never performed better than in 1948. He led in 10 offensive categories, including a .376 batting average that was only surpassed once in the National League for the rest of the century.
It was at Braves Field in Boston. And in that game, he was badly injured. In excruciating pain, Musial had 5 hits. The interesting thing about that game was that he only swung the bat 5 times. 5 swings, 5 hits.
Before a doubleheader, he was once in the clubhouse dressed in his underwear and walking around the clubhouse holding his bat. Musial was saying, 10 hits for Stanley today. Stanley can get 10. Talking himself into it.
He was just an extraordinary hitter. Somebody we probably haven't seen the likes of since.
Musial, a 3-time MVP and 3-time World Series champion, is among the all-time leaders in nearly every major hitting category. Despite his remarkable numbers, Stan the Man wasn't as celebrated as his contemporaries, Ted Williams and Joe DiMaggio.
Stan Musial, all you got is hit after hit after hit, record after record after record, and a life of simple, unspectacular, but constant decency.
Musial is maybe the most overlooked great baseball player. He just sort of disappeared into the background, which is it's a shame and it's a crime, because Musial was an absolutely great baseball player.
I mean, if anybody was ever appropriately named, it was Stan the Man, because when you think of Musial, you think of the man before you do Musial, because he's a man in every way.
Stan the Man for sure. Stan Musial remains the Cardinals franchise leader in 6 major categories despite retiring 50 years ago. Tops in Cardinals history in home runs, RBI, walks, hits, wins above replacement in games, and of 2 Hall of Famers in Lou Brock and Rogers Hornsby, as well as another future Hall of Famer in Albert Pujols.
George Vexey, the sports writer for the New York Times, wrote a biography of Stan Musial, and here he talks a little bit about him.
How will you remember Stan the Man?
Well, I remember him from my childhood when he used to come into Brooklyn. I lived in the adjacent borough. He used to come into Brooklyn. He used to moiter us, as we say. You know, we get 5 or 10 hits a game or a doubleheader, pop up at second base after a double and smile on his face. And in those nice days, in those days, you could actually respect and love a visiting player, and he was loved. Of course, we gave him his nickname, as your show pointed out.
George, Stan the Man played in 3,026 games, never was ejected. What kind of man was he on and off the field?
Well, he was a gentleman. He lived the mid-century American life, the Eisenhower era, whatever you want to call it. He typified the kind of country that I think we had a self-image of at mid-century, of the America that was, going out to win the wars, to end all wars, and help people out, and a generous place. And that was his role. In baseball, he was nice to people, nice to the fans, great teammate to almost everybody that met him. And in his business life, in his family life, he was the perfect man for his adopted home of St. Louis, in that where he ran the restaurant, he not only was a good restaurant man, he knew the steaks and he knew the menu and he knew but he was there for people. He was also that way with fans. He'd sign autographs until the last person had gone home. Perfect guy for St. Louis, for mid-America, and really for the country. Something came up before. I just heard a few minutes ago talking about him being obscured. That was really after the fact. In the post-war decade, from 46 to 55, he was voted the greatest American baseball player, ahead of the aging Williams, the aging DiMaggio, and Jackie Robinson. He was voted the best player for that decade. And people forget now, but when he played, he was known to be a great player at that level.
Here's the longtime Cardinal broadcaster Jack Buck, father of Joe Buck, commenting on Musial, who he broadcast so many times.
When Musial retired, I cried in every ballpark in the National League. Every place they went, in the last trip in, they honored Musial. I cried. He didn't cry. Musial didn't cry, but I cried. When you used to hear about this guy, you say, well, it can't be true. Then when you meet him, you say, it's an act. And then when you watch it and watch it and watch it and watch him perform, and then after he quit, the way he reports himself, you say, it's amazing. He's one of a kind. And then you look in the record book and see what he did, and you see where he came from and all kinds of things. You say that they won't make him like that anymore.
When I was a little boy, I saw Musial play at Wrigley Field. He had this corkscrew stance. He had this crouch, and he didn't exactly face the pitcher. He could get around on the ball incredibly quickly. When Musial broke in 1941, Ted Lyons, who was a great pitcher for the White Sox, saw him and said, Musial's batting stance looks like a small boy looking around a corner to see if the cops are coming. What one of the players did say before was true. He was one of those players you did watch in batting practice. Some of his greatest games were at Wrigley Field. It was a small park. And one of his opposite field hits was one of the most memorable in 1958, his 3,000th hit when there were only 8 players who had 3,000 hits. Here's the call. And you Cub and Cardinal fans, let's see if you recognize the voice of the man calling the game.
Wrigley Field, home of the rival Chicago Cubs.
Here's the pitch. Line drive, it is! Into left field! Hit number 3,000! Musial ran first! On his way to second with a double!
That's right, that was Harry Carey, but that was when he was broadcasting the Cardinals. And Stan Musial was one of his favorite players. He used to talk about him a lot. Just an interesting tidbit that you didn't hear anywhere else, but Stan Musial was involved in one of the weirdest plays in baseball history where there were 2 live balls on the field at once. On June 30th, 1959, one of the weirdest moments in baseball history occurred, and needless to say, it happened at Wrigley Field. Somehow there were 2 balls in play at one time. It all started when a missed strike 3 got away from Cubs catcher Sammy Taylor. Taylor, thinking it was a foul ball, didn't go after the ball. The bat boy, also thinking it was a foul ball, picked it up and tossed it to the field announcer, Pat Piper, who in those days sat on the field right behind home plate. Piper saw that the batter was running to first base, so he realized it was a live ball and let it drop at his feet. Third baseman Alvin Dark ran over to grab it. Meanwhile, the umpire gave Sammy Taylor a new ball out of habit. In the confusion of the runner on first base, who was Stan Musial, made a run for second. Cubs pitcher Bob Anderson took the ball out of Sammy Taylor's mitt and fired it to second base. At the same time, third baseman Al Dark threw his ball to second base. Ernie Banks was covering second and caught one of the balls heading his way while the other ball escaped into center field. Banks tagged Musial out with one ball while center fielder Bobby Thompson lobbed the other ball into the dugout. Thinking that the real ball had been tossed into the dugout, Musial just kept on running and scored. The umpires had a long discussion about the play on the field before finally ruling that Musial was out because Ernie tagged him. The Cardinals were enraged by the call on the field and lodged an official protest. The protest wasn't necessary because, of course, the Cardinals won the game anyway, 4-1. As I said, Stan Musial had some of his greatest games at Wrigley Field. Here's a little about Stan Musial in retirement, a little bit from him. He wasn't an especially dynamic interview.
After retiring, Musial moved to the Cardinals front office and served as general manager for one season. That season was 1967, and in typical Musial fashion, the team excelled, winning the pennant and the World Series.
The Cardinals win. They're the new world champions.
He was elected to the Hall of Fame in 1969 in his first year of eligibility with 93.2% of the votes. That meant he spent more than 40 years as a living Hall of Famer.
So it's a pleasure and honor to be part of this great game, and I hope that I gave baseball as much as it gave to me.
He continued to live in St. Louis and remained married to his high school sweetheart Lillian for more than 70 years. Musial represented all that was right about our national pastime.
We're going to sing a song we all know and love, Take Me Out to the Ball Game.
In recent years, Musial threw out the first pitch for the decisive Game 5 of the 2006 World Series and delivered the ceremonial first pitch ball to President Barack Obama before the 2009 All-Star Game in St. Louis. Perhaps Ford Frick said it best in a quote inscribed on the Stan Musial statue that sits in front of Busch Stadium. Here stands baseball's perfect warrior. Here stands baseball's perfect knight.
As far as I was concerned, I was most happiest when I put on the uniform and played baseball.
Musial wasn't a great one for quotes, but one of the greatest sports quotes that I ever heard was about Musial and to Musial. It was by John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who went to the 1962 All-Star Game in Washington, D.C. Kennedy was 45 at the time, and Musial was 42, but still playing pretty well. And Kennedy told Musial, a couple of years ago, they told me I was too young to be president, you were too old to be playing baseball. But we both fooled them. The year after that, Musial retired, and Kennedy was assassinated, and soon after that, President Johnson made him the head of his National Council on Physical Fitness. Well, as I said before, Musial wasn't a great interview, but he was a great harmonica player, and here he is at the Hall of Fame.
One of the best hitters of all time, Stan the Man Musial. 22 years, 18 times he hit 300, won 7 National League batting titles. Ladies and gentlemen, a couple of years ago, we asked Stan, the best harmonica playing Hall of Famer ever, to play. You want to bring him back this year? Can you do it? Did you bring it? What do you want to play, Stan?
We're going to play Take Me Out to the Ball Game. We're all going to sing it, too.
Somehow I can't imagine a current major leaguer or current Hall of Famer doing that. But we're going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer Sid Tepps. And as a final tribute to Stan Musial, one of the most popular, if not the most popular man ever in St. Louis, we're going to use another favored son of St. Louis who wrote a song that wasn't technically about Stan Musial, but it contained a verse about a baseball hero who was a brown-eyed, handsome man, so I think that's close enough. Here is that other favored son of St. Louis, Chuck Berry.
2-3 in the count with nobody on. He hit a high fly into the stand. Round the third, he was headed for home. It was a brown-eyed, handsome man that won the game. It was a brown-eyed, handsome man.